Background information emerges in the imminent breakup between the Jets and Aaron Rodgers. Apparently, Aaron Glenn had some demands of the quarterback. Let's break down what this all means today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Wednesday, February 12th, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listener, first watch every day. And a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. It's Wednesday, which means it's time for our weekly mailbag. Each Wednesday, we try and do a mailbag with listener questions. Thanks so much to everybody who sent in questions. Our first question, John, I'm sure you've read the article on The Athletic about the meeting between Aaron Glenn and Aaron Rodgers. What do you make of it? So yes, everybody's favorite, every Jets fan's favorite reporter, Diana Rossini, had an article out yesterday which provided some insider information on the meeting that the Jets had with Aaron Rodgers. And this was the meeting that Jay Glazer discussed on Fox right before the Super Bowl, which indicated that the Jets had decided they were going to move on from Rodgers. And what Rossini reported is that in this meeting, the Jets were undecided whether to go forward with Rodgers, but they were open to the possibility if Rodgers agreed to make the following adjustments. One is that Rodgers would no longer be permitted to make outside media appearances during the season, including his regular paid appearances on the Pat McAfee show. Two, he would be required to attend all mandatory practices. Last year, Rodgers missed 2 mandatory minicamp practices due to a previously scheduled vacation trip to Egypt. So these are demands, these are asks that the Jets had of Aaron Rodgers, evidently. And I guess reading between the lines, these were not really things Rodgers was open to. Now, I've been on record on this. I don't think in a vacuum it's a big deal that Rodgers skipped those minicamp practices. I don't think that Rodgers skipping minicamp practices are the reasons he struggled last year. I certainly don't think it's the reason the Jets went 5-12. And even his weekly McAfee show interviews aren't that big of a deal. But I think this speaks to something bigger. And I think that Aaron Glenn, and I know that this is an overused phrase, but I think this is a sign of Aaron Glenn trying to establish a culture. And why do I say that? Well, the last 2 years, the Jets have made it pretty clear that Aaron Rodgers was the most important person in this organization. And the Jets, I'm sure there's like a less loaded way to say this, but the Jets have made it clear that Rodgers was bigger than the rest of the team. They made it clear he was more important than any other player, that he was more important than any coach, he was more important than the head coach, he was more important than the general manager. And Aaron Glenn's going to come in and change that. Now, I think if you're being objective about this, a Jets team quarterbacked by Aaron Rodgers is not really a Super Bowl contender in 2025. And I think this is an entirely different story if Rodgers was still playing at an MVP level and he's a guy that could take you to the Super Bowl. Because at that situation, you kind of put up with that stuff. And I think that's been true of Rodgers his whole career. Rodgers has been a guy who comes with a lot of extracurricular stuff. And he was so good through most of his career that it's just something the Packers dealt with. The Jets were expecting him to be that good, so it's something they dealt with. This year, the biggest argument I heard for bringing Rodgers back was he's going to be the bridge quarterback. Okay, well, you know what? A bridge quarterback is not a guy who's super important to your organization. A bridge quarterback is somebody you expect to get you through a year, to train the next generation of players. He's a guy you don't expect to go to Egypt for mandatory minicamp. He's not a guy you expect to go on. You expect to do consistent national interviews where he's generating headlines that have on topics that have nothing to do with football. If you're saying you want Aaron Rodgers back as the bridge quarterback, well, this is what being a bridge quarterback entails. The trappings of being the franchise quarterback, the trappings of being the franchise player no longer apply, because there are lots of guys you could go out to be a bridge quarterback for a year. A lot of guys who could get you through a year. And look, if Rodgers doesn't want to do that, can I blame him? Well, no. I mean, he's played at a certain level. He's become accustomed to a team treating him a certain way through most of his career. I think he's within his rights. If he doesn't want to do it and he's straight about that, I don't think you can have any hard feelings about that. Rodgers can decide whether there's a team that's willing to give him what he wants or whether he wants to retire, and that's fair. And I certainly wouldn't begrudge Rodgers for not accepting a change because, like the Jets have treated him a certain way for 2 years. And I think that's one of the complications. I just think it's difficult for Jets team that's pretty much given him everything he wanted for 2 years to now go to him and say, you're just another player. But that's what Aaron Glenn needs to do. Aaron Glenn, if you're not going to be a Super Bowl team next year, the next year's all about building for the future. And Aaron Glenn needs to establish credibility. He needs to establish that he's going to have a program where everybody's treated exactly the same. What I don't understand is there's like this segment of the fan base that's, watched Aaron Rodgers quarterback a team that went 5-12. And they've determined that like letting Rodgers go has destroyed what would be a great 2025. And now the Jets are guaranteed to go, 4-13. I really don't understand that mindset. And there's lots of talk about like Rodgers' statistics, but people say, well, look at his numbers. They were good. Well, they really weren't that good. I mean, I don't think anybody, if you had told anybody that those would be his statistics before the season started, there's not a single Jets fan who would have signed up for that. And all of this is just pointing to the idea that, it's time to move forward. I think it's a good thing for both parties to split. Rodgers very well may end up retiring. It doesn't sound like, it sounds like he might be going to the darkness again this year to figure out whether he wants to return. But even if he does want to return, it really should be somewhere else. Maybe there's a team that will give him what he wants. But that team can't be the Jets right now. Rodgers himself said heading into this season that, and he was talking about Robert Saleh and Joe Douglas. He pretty much said, if we don't win, we're all out of here next year. And I think the Jets symbolically just really need to turn the page from this. It's a move that just has not panned out in any way. And I'll say this, still in the cautiously optimistic phase with Aaron Glenn. When the Jets hired him, I was leaning positive. I can't say I'm like all the way there. I'm leaning more positive now because I will say this, the way this was handled gives me confidence because for the first time in at least 2 years, it feels like the Jets are running like a professional football operation again. It's been a long time. The last 2 years, it's felt like the Jets have been a team that's been like trying to win the back pages, trying to win Twitter, trying to make the most popular move possible because it would be very easy to just announce we're bringing Rodgers back if he wants to play again next year and we're going to give him whatever he wants because that would be a very popular move on Twitter right now. It'd be a very popular move, in the media. It would be a very popular move online. The Jets are not focused on that, though. The Jets are not focused for the first time in a while. It feels like the Jets are not focused on buzz. It feels like the Jets are focused on what's right for the team going forward. And in the NFL, sometimes the right move, sometimes the move that helps you win is not the most popular move in the moment. In fact, that's frequently the case for a lot of reasons we discuss in great detail on this podcast. So I think that Glenn's conditions for bringing Rodgers back are reasonable. I think they kept an open mind. And look, I mean, if you want Rodgers back as a bridge quarterback, what bridge quarterback is constantly doing the weekly interview on ESPN? What bridge quarterback isn't there for the offseason program? These are things you'd expect a guy who's just there to catch you to the next season to do or not do. So I think that this was – I really liked what I heard, the way the Jets handled this. I think that they were decisive. They did not drag things out. And I think that this is a good early sign. It's, there's a long way to go. A lot of moves have to be made. A lot has to be corrected on this team. But encouraging stuff for me in the early days of the Aaron Glenn, Darren Muji era. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about another guy from a past era. That's Mekhi Becton. He just won the Super Bowl with the Philadelphia Eagles. And the Jets are getting some criticism for how they handled him. How much criticism do they really deserve, though? We'll discuss that continuing here on our Wednesday mailbag edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. When the game tips off, NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better way to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because with FanDuel, you can place live bets through the game. So even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. You might love using FanDuel's live betting feature because it keeps every moment of every game exciting. Whether you're backing your team for a late-game rally or picking a player to hit a clutch three, you'll never feel like you missed your chance. Plus, the app is easy to use, and when you win, you get paid instantly. And right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the National Basketball Association. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. And a big shout out to you, everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. We continue with our weekly mailbag. Our next question is from Taylor, who writes, "Hey, John, Mekhi Becton is now a Super Bowl winner, only 1 year removed from the Jets. Was Joe Douglas right about him all along, and the coaches never figured out how to properly utilize him? And do you think the offensive line is in better shape now with younger talent such as Vera-Tucker and Fashanu?" Well, I'll answer the last question first. This is the best position the Jets' offensive line has been in quite a while. I'm very optimistic about this Jets offensive line. They got to figure out right tackle. Morgan Moses is a free agent, but this is the first time in a long time where I can say I'm very confident at 4 of the 5 spots. Fashanu looked really good as the season progressed at left tackle. John Simpson looks solid at right guard. Joe Tippmann, I like Joe Tippmann at center, and Alijah Vera-Tucker finally stayed healthy at right guard. Now, as for as Becton goes, Jets are getting a lot of criticism. Becton's one of the stories because he had such a rough time with the Jets and goes to the Eagles and has success at the right guard there, and wins the Super Bowl his first season. This is a complex issue, and there's a lot of nuance in here. I mean, I think the first thing you have to note about Becton is that he suffered 2 very serious knee injuries, which played a big role in derailing his Jets career. So that's number one. We go deeper than that. I think you have to remember in situations like this, the price and the resources teams allocate for a player. The Jets drafted Mekhi Becton 11th overall to be their franchise left tackle. The Eagles bought low on Becton. They signed him for a very cheap deal to play right guard. And guard is important in the NFL. Guards are not easy to find in today's NFL, but ultimately a left tackle is much more valuable than a right guard. The Eagles paid a low price and are playing him at a lower priority position. That's something that needs to be noted here. I think that if you want to criticize the Jets, I don't think it's that they let this gem get away. I don't think it's that they let this great player get away, because I still don't think Becton is a great player. And I watched the Eagles a bunch this year. I think that he's a guy like the question asked, was Joe Douglas right about Becton? Nobody ever questioned whether Becton had a lot of physical talent. That was clear from day one. The issue with Becton is even if I get past the injuries, and look, the injuries were obviously a role in his demise with the New York Jets. But the Jets drafted him 11th overall over Tristan Wirfs. And one of the rationales you heard about that over and over was that, well, the Jets needed a left tackle. So Becton was the guy over Wirfs. Well, Becton can't play left tackle. Tristan Wirfs is now a left tackle. The other argument was Becton has a higher, because I said this myself, Becton has a higher ceiling than Wirfs. Wirfs is one of the best tackles in the league. It's tough to have a higher ceiling than Tristan Wirfs. So the rationales for drafting Becton in that spot really went out the window. And while we don't know how Becton's career would have panned out if he hadn't suffered those 2 injuries, it's very, very difficult to come up with a scenario where he would have been a better pick than Tristan Wirfs. So that's where I get on the Jets. Look, when a guy goes somewhere else and has success and wins the Super Bowl, nobody wants to hear criticism of that player. And again, some of the stuff was beyond Becton's control. Now, I'm going to be very careful with what I say here because I don't want this to turn into a big thing. And look, if you listen to this show consistently, I'm not somebody who's trying to be an insider. I will say that I've come across some information about Becton's time with the Jets, and the information I've come across would suggest that some of the issues during his time here were on him. I think from what I've heard, there were issues with conditioning. There were issues with effort, with coachability. There were problems. That's my understanding, is that there were some issues there that probably were on Becton. And sometimes a guy needs to get knocked down to have the motivation to rebound. There are some guys who aren't ready when they're first drafted, and maybe they need to fail a little bit to get the fire that they need to succeed. And I think that might be the case to some extent with Becton. Look, if you followed this show, you know what I think of the guy who was the Jets offensive line coach the last 2 years, Keith Carter. I think he's one of the worst coaches in the NFL on any level. And Becton goes to the Eagles with a really good offensive line coach and has success. There's something to that, clearly. But Becton's also on a loaded offensive line. He's probably the weakest of the five on that great offensive line in Philadelphia. Saying that you're the fifth best guy on a great offensive line at right guard, that's different from just justifying being drafted 11th overall at left tackle. So there's stuff you can blame on the Jets, clearly. There's probably some stuff you can blame on Becton. Ultimately, though, I mean, I think the criticism you have to have on the Jets is that they picked him 11th overall to be the left tackle. Because, what were they supposed to do? Did you want them to, when Becton was here, did you want them to move him to guard and play Connor McDermott at tackle? Would that have made any sense? Becton was pretty vocal that he didn't even want to play right tackle. He didn't want to play. If he didn't want to play guard, then if he didn't want to play right tackle, was he going to be willing to play guard? I think that's tough. That's something that's tough to get on the Jets for. The other aspect of this, it's not like the Jets need a guard right now. They have two good guards in John Simpson and Alijah Vera-Tucker. So I don't think they're really losing out on Becton. I think it's just a situation where you always say this. Sometimes a guy needs a fresh start. And Becton got his fresh start. He went to the right place, found the right team, found a great situation for him, and is having success and won the Super Bowl. So did Braden Mann. My joke is that Braden Mann's now a Super Bowl champion too. Everyone was talking about Becton. Everyone's ignoring the real guy that won the Super Bowl, Braden Mann, the former Jets punter. That's just the way it goes. Sometimes a guy finds a home when he struggles early in his career, and I think that's clearly what's happened with Becton here. Next question, John. Apart from figuring out the long-term solution at quarterback, what are the biggest things the Jets can do to be consistently competitive now in the future? Well, at the risk of repeating myself, I think this is an offseason where you focus on internal affairs, because this is a team that's got some good players, and we got some talent here. This is not like a situation where things are really bleak. It's kind of funny because the fan base has done a complete 180. We've gone from saying this was a Super Bowl caliber team in August and September to now saying we're going to be the worst team in the NFL. The reality is that this was never a Super Bowl caliber roster. People were overrating it then. Now we've kind of gone to the opposite extreme where we're underselling how good this talent is. But a lot of this talent is not under contract in the long run. And that's something that's got to be, I think the biggest focus of this offseason is not on necessarily filling all the holes. It's on making sure you got your core locked up. It's bringing back Jamie and Sherwood, who was really good this year at linebacker. It's, addressing Alijah Vera-Tucker, who's about to hit free agency. It's in a year. It's about, giving Garrett Wilson and Sauce Gardner long-term deals to keep them here. This is different from past Jets rebuilds because we actually have a good core in place. It's just the last 2 years we forgot to build around the core because we were so focused on doing everything Aaron Rodgers wanted. But if you can build around, this is a great starting point. It wasn't enough that that just adding the quarterback was going to take you to the Super Bowl, but it's a very good start. And the Jets are better off than they have been in some time if they would just realize it and lock these guys up. So that to me is the biggest thing. That to me is the goal of the offseason. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about the last 2 years. Who's really to blame for everything that went wrong? Aaron Rodgers, ownership. Where do we go? Who do we assess the blame on? I think like the Becton situation, it's complicated. It's nuanced. There's a lot of places to look, and we'll go there as we continue here on this Wednesday edition of Locked On Jets. This Wednesday edition of Locked On Jets is brought to you by PrizePicks. Football may be over, but basketball's in full swing, and there's no better way to stay in the game than with PrizePicks, the best place for daily fantasy sports. With PrizePicks, you can pick more or less on at least 2-player projections, and if you're right, you can win up to 1,000 times your cash. The best part? PrizePicks is quick and easy. You can set your lineup in less than 60 seconds, and their fast and secure withdrawals mean you get your winnings in as little as 15 minutes. Plus, you got to love their weekly promos like Taco Tuesday, where you get discounted player projections for even better value. Download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's code LOCKEDONNFL. It's one word with no space, LOCKEDON NFL for $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. PrizePicks, run your game. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Wednesday. We're doing our weekly mailbag show. Our next question, John, why do you think Tom Brady was so successful in Tampa Bay compared with what happened in New York with Rodgers? Who do you pin most of the blame on the failure for? Rodgers or the organization? Well, I think like the Becton question we had earlier, there are a couple of layers to this. I think number one, Tampa Bay was closer to being able to win a Super Bowl than the Jets were. I think the Jets went a little overboard with what happened in 2022. I think they simultaneously overreacted to a winning streak and overreacted to a losing streak, because at one point in 2022, the team was 5-2. They were on a 4-game winning streak, and things kind of fell apart from there after Breece Hall got injured. I know they had a couple wins after that. They had a win over Buffalo, then they had a win over Chicago Thanksgiving weekend. But the Jets then lost their last 6. And it feels like they kind of overestimated how good they were because of that early season winning streak. And they overestimated how much the quarterback would make a difference, because I think the perception was after that 5-2 start that they were a quarterback away from making noise. And it wasn't quite that simple. The Tampa Bay team was just more talented that when Brady arrived there. So I think that was an element to it. The other, I feel like such a bad Jets fan for saying this, but I think it's true, is that Tom Brady is uncomparable to anybody else. I mean, even Aaron Rodgers, I don't think compares with Tom Brady. And Brady, first of all, had a game that was built to age really well, because he was never really a guy who moved around that much, but he was also just fanatical about his health. I mean, the TB12 method, everybody's heard of it now. It's the type of thing that helped Brady extend his career and remain an elite quarterback into his mid-40s. Rodgers just doesn't seem like he trains his body at that level. And the other aspect of this is, like, Rodgers' last year in Green Bay was the worst year of his career at that point. So there were signs that he was already beginning to decline. I don't think it was realistic to expect Rodgers to be great into his mid-40s the way Brady was. And Rodgers' game was not built to age as well, because Rodgers depended a lot on his mobility. In fact, I think I've always said, like, one of the things that I thought set Rodgers apart was his ability to extend plays with his legs. And, he may not have been a great rusher of the football, but he was great at extending plays with his legs and then just throwing an absolute strike 20 yards down the field on the run. So when his mobility left, it impacted him more than it did Brady. Brady was never really a guy who moved at all. Brady's movements were more like sliding, stepping up in the pocket, or sliding suddenly left or right to navigate the pass rush and find a throwing lane. So Brady was always built, Brady was always going to age better than Rodgers. I think coaching also comes into play here. Look, Tampa Bay had a much better coaching staff than the Jets did. And I feel like Bruce Arians saw Tom Brady as his ticket to win a Super Bowl, and Robert Saleh saw Aaron Rodgers as his ticket to save his job. I think there's a huge difference between having Bruce Arians as your head coach and having Robert Saleh as your head coach. So there are no simple answers. And look, that doesn't even get into the owner, who just was a disaster the last 2 years. The owner, there's no other way to put it. Woody Johnson damaged this team the last 2 years. And that's true in a lot of ways. But after the Rodgers trade, I mean, we just talked about it on yesterday's show. First of all, bringing back Robert Saleh after 2023 is tough to defend, but then firing him 5 games into the season just sent the team into chaos. And, you always hear whenever there are players who have spoken about this, and, you always hear whenever there's some controversial statement, why doesn't anybody put their name to it? There are players who have put their name to the idea. There are players who have said this in public, that firing Saleh, that was the point of no turning back for the team, because it sent such shockwaves through the team, and there was no real plan of succession. There was no real plan to replace Saleh and reshuffle the coaching staff in an effective way. It just completely backfired, and there are so many issues with the owner that we can and have dedicated multiple episodes to the destructive nature of Woody Johnson has had on this team the last 2 years. So there were a lot of differences. I felt like even at the time the Jets made the trade, that there were more differences with the Tampa situation with Brady than there were similarities. I felt that the comparisons in many ways were pretty superficial, and it obviously turned out to be that way. Next question. Injuries are common in the NFL. A big knock on the New York Jets is how they deal with their injured players. Often reported by players and ex-players how poorly the Jets treated their injuries. An example is Mekhi Becton. Does this come from the culture above? Who or whom is to blame regarding the Jets' medical team and training staff? Well, didn't they just like? I remember the Jets made a big deal that they were changing their training staff. So it's difficult to say. I mean, the Jets are not the Jets have not been an organization that's been cutting edge in anything that they've done. So like these how players train is not really public information, and there's not really a lot of ways to compare training staffs. But would I be shocked to find out that maybe the Jets weren't on the cutting edge of training their players, using sports science, using player tracking data to try and limit injuries and prevent injuries? No, I would not. I mean, one issue that's obvious and been discussed ad nauseum is the MetLife Stadium turf. And I remember a couple of years ago, there was one listener who kept emailing me about the MetLife Stadium turf. In fact, this listener wanted me to do like a week long. I think this listener wanted me to do like a week long series with my colleague Patricia, who was Locked On Giants, on the MetLife Stadium turf. And I remember thinking, like, it's a really good idea. I just don't really know enough about turf to have to offer that much insight on it. But players have complained about it. We know back in 2020, the 49ers suffered a bunch of serious injuries, and they complained about the turf. We know that we've seen studies from the NFL from the NFL Players Association that turf is more likely to cause injuries than natural grass surfaces. We've heard a lot of anecdotal evidence about MetLife, a lot of anecdotal talk about the MetLife Stadium turf not being good on players. So maybe that's got something to do with it. It's tough to say. I mean, the one thing I'll say is that this year, it felt like the Jets were not like overly injured this year. So it's, these things can come and go. And I think it's also worth acknowledging, first of all, that, injuries do happen in this league. Second of all, the Jets in recent years have kind of bet on guys who are relatively injury-prone players. So that's also a factor. So again, I don't think there are any simple answers to this. Those are just what I think are some of the factors. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Wednesday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.